Patrick bonded out. That's the update people rush to turn into a conclusion, and it shouldn't be. Bond does not equal innocence. Release does not equal vindication. And freedom from a cell does not mean freedom from accountability. So before anyone rewrites the story, let's slow it down. Because the question hasn't changed. Who exploited the Whittaker family? And how did it happen? I want to say this clearly, because clarity matters more than loyalty. I was wrong about Patrick Rourke. Not because it's trendy to say that. Not because public opinion shifted. Because facts did. And changing your mind when new information appears isn't weakness. It's independence. There's a difference between giving someone the benefit of the doubt and protecting a lie once it's exposed. I'll do the first. I won't do the second. Lying is one of the few boundaries that permanently closes a door for me. Patrick crossed that line. Some people hear that and immediately try to redirect. What about Justin? What about the camper? I'm not doing that. Not because those questions don't matter, but because they're being used to derail the core issue. If Justin lied about a camper, that's Justin's issue. Deal with him directly. Patrick told me things about the Whittakers that were not true. Patrick promised things that did not happen. Patrick benefited while the family waited. That's the lane we're in. Here's where people get confused, and I need to be precise so nobody twists this. Lack of courage does not automatically equal lack of care. A person can care and still fail to stand up. A person can love and still be cowardly. That's true. But here's the distinction that matters. Cowardice explains silence. It does not explain exploitation. Patrick didn't just fail to fight for the family. He took from them. And taking from a family, while claiming to care for them, is not cowardice. It's something else entirely. Let's remove Patrick's name for a moment. Call him John Doe. John Doe says he's going to pay a family for content that uses their lives, their vulnerabilities, their image. John Doe doesn't pay them. Instead, other people step in and cover debts John Doe said he would handle. Then John Doe borrows money from supporters, money he never intends to pay back, under the banner of helping the family. Where does some of that money go? To John Doe, not to the family. That's not confusion. That's not delay. That's not miscommunication. That's misrepresentation. Now layer this on top of what's come out since. There are allegations, now supported by multiple accounts, that before money entered the picture, Patrick was not a benevolent figure in the Whittakers' lives. Throwing rocks, bullying behavior, disrespect toward the household. That matters because it answers a question people keep avoiding. How does someone go from tormentor to protector? Money. Money changes incentives. Money reframes stories. Money makes exploitation feel like opportunity. So when Patrick later positioned himself as someone who loved Timmy, we have to ask a harder question. Did he love Timmy? Or did Timmy become access? Let's talk about Timmy Whittaker, because this entire debate collapses if we don't center him honestly. Timmy is 46 years old, but he is not a typical 46-year-old man. He is nonverbal, cognitively impaired, dependent. He cannot advocate for himself in the ways people online pretend he can. So when people say Timmy knew what he was saying or Timmy understood everything, they're not being charitable. They're being reckless. Understanding a moment is not understanding consequences. Compliance is not consent. And consent is not legally available to Timmy in the way it is to others. That's not an insult. That's reality. Patrick took Timmy places. That part is true. But look closer. There were places Patrick wanted to go. If Timmy came along, Patrick had content. If Patrick had content, he had engagement. If he had engagement, he had money. That's not companionship. That's utility. And when you combine that with filming, branding, and monetization, you don't get friendship. You get a product. People keep pointing to the experiences Timmy had as proof of Patrick's goodness. Trips, outings, moments. But here's the question nobody answers. If Patrick genuinely cared, why did he leave? Why did he enhance his own house while the family waited for money he said he would pay? Why did he speak about the Whittakers publicly as if they were obstacles rather than people? Why did he act as though paying them was optional, dependent on his mood, instead of an obligation? That's not how you treat people you respect. That's how you treat assets you control. Now let's talk about charm, because charm is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Patrick is charming. I won't deny that. But charm is not character. Charm is a tool. And when charm disappears the moment someone questions you, that tells you exactly what role it was playing. Many of you know this personally. When you stopped praising Patrick, when you asked hard questions, when you couldn't give him what he wanted, the tone changed. Insults came out. Degradation followed. Respect vanished. That pattern doesn't belong to someone who cares. It belongs to someone who tolerates you only while you're useful. Now we have to widen the frame. Because Patrick didn't operate alone. Which brings us to Eric Carroll. I want to be very clear here, because people love to flatten this. Agreeing with criticism of Patrick does not require pretending Eric is innocent. I don't believe Eric is innocent. Not because I need a villain, but because we watched behavior. We saw lies. We saw bad conduct. We saw family separation. We saw money stop flowing once attention dipped. A month before, great family. I'll do everything for them. Once money slowed, trash the family. Walk away. Disappear. That's not coincidence. That's conditional care. Here's something people misunderstand about critical thinking. I don't have to agree with everything someone says to agree with some of it. That doesn't make me a flip-flopper. It makes me selective. If that concept is confusing, that's not my problem. I'll give people the benefit of the doubt until they prove they don't deserve it. Patrick proved that. Eric hasn't proven innocence either. Both things can be true. And now Patrick is out on bond. Some people are celebrating that. Others are funding his commissary. Ask yourself why. Why is there always a group willing to support someone who benefited from exploitation while the vulnerable are left behind? Why does sympathy flow upward to the abuser and not downward to the family? That's not loyalty. That's desperation dressed up as devotion. Here's the part one won't soften. Supporting Patrick now is not a neutral act. It's a choice. A choice to comfort someone who already took too much, while the Whittakers are still paying the price. If that's what love looks like to you, ask yourself a hard question. Would you want your daughter treated that way? Because standards don't change just because the victim is poor, disabled, or unpopular. This story isn't about popularity. I don't care about being popular online. I care about being honest. And the honest truth is this. Patrick didn't care about the Whittakers the way he said he did. Eric played a role in enabling the collapse. Timmy was used. Bond doesn't change that. Does bonding out change anything for you? Or does accountability still matter more? If you want to understand who exploited the Whittaker family, you don't start with personalities. You start with money. Because money doesn't argue back. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't get emotional. It simply shows you who had leverage and who didn't. And once you follow that trail, the story becomes much harder to romanticize. Let's clear something up immediately. Exploitation does not require stealing everything. It only requires controlling enough. Enough to delay. Enough to decide timing. Enough to create dependence. Enough to position yourself as the gatekeeper between need and relief. That's how exploitation works in the real world. Quietly, incrementally, under the language of help. Patrick said he was going to pay the Whittakers. That's not disputed. That's not interpretation. That's a promise he made repeatedly. He didn't. Instead, the family waited. And while they waited, other people stepped in, donors, supporters, viewers, and paid debts Patrick said he would cover. That moment matters more than people realize. Because once others are paying what you promised to pay, you are no longer helping. You are borrowing credibility. Here's the question nobody wants to answer honestly. If Patrick truly intended to pay the Whittakers, why didn't he step back from content until he did? Why continue filming? Why continue monetizing? Why continue presenting himself as their advocate? Because stopping content would have meant stopping income. And stopping income would have meant losing control. Now let's talk about borrowing. Patrick borrowed money from supporters, not for emergencies, not transparently, not with clear repayment plans. And multiple people now say, independently, that repayment was never intended. That matters because borrowing under false pretenses is not help. It's leverage acquisition. When you borrow money while positioning yourself as the intermediary for a vulnerable family, you're not just taking funds. You're taking trust. And where did some of that money go? Not to the Whittakers, to Patrick. This is where people get uncomfortable and start reaching for excuses. Well, he had expenses. Well, he was stressed. Well, things happen. No, expenses don't justify misrepresentation. Stress doesn't justify delay without disclosure. Things happening doesn't justify silence. Because here's the standard that matters. If the money was for the family should not have been the last to receive it. That's it. Now, let's widen the frame. Patrick didn't just control money. He controlled timing. He decided when the Whittakers got help, when it had to wait, when promises were postponed, when excuses were offered. That's power. And power exercised over people who are poor, disabled, and dependent is never neutral. It creates hierarchy. Let's talk about content again, because money and content are inseparable here. The Whittakers were not just beneficiaries. They were the product. Their lives, their hardships, their vulnerability. That content drove engagement. Engagement drove donations. Donations flowed through intermediaries. And the family? They waited. That's not charity. That's extraction. Now, add Eric Carroll back into the picture. Because Patrick did not manage this environment alone. When people say, Eric denies guilt, they're again answering the wrong question. The question isn't guilt. The question is function. Who helped maintain the system once money started slowing? Who helped manage perception? Who helped distance the family when they became inconvenient? Who helped normalize delay? You don't need criminal intent to enable exploitation. You only need to keep things running. Here's the pattern that keeps repeating. As long as money flowed, the family was great. As long as engagement stayed high, help was promised. As long as content performed, optimism was sold. When money slowed, tone changed. Blame appeared. Distance grew. Support vanished. That's conditional care. And conditional care is not care. People keep saying, but Patrick did things for Timmy. Yes, he took him places. But here's the uncomfortable truth. There were places Patrick wanted to go. And if Timmy came along, Patrick could justify the trip as benevolence while filming it for content. So whose experience was it really? Timmy's? Or Patrick's, subsidized by Timmy's presence? Let's talk about the couch. Offering Betty a couch or a bed after everything that happened gets framed as kindness. It's not. It's control theater. Because real generosity doesn't come after exploitation. It comes before. Real generosity doesn't wait until public scrutiny grows. It doesn't come with strings. It doesn't require patience from a person owed. It doesn't say, I'll pay you when I feel like it. And that phrase matters. I'll pay you when I feel like it. That's not help. That's dominance. It communicates one thing very clearly. You don't decide when you're compensated. I do. And when the people on the receiving end are already powerless, that imbalance becomes exploitation. Now let's address the argument that Patrick was being controlled at some point. Even if that were true, and there's no verified proof, it wouldn't absolve him. Because if your hands are tied, you don't lie about it. You don't posture. You don't trash the family. You don't pretend you're in control when you're not. You say, I can't do this right now. Honesty is the bare minimum. Patrick didn't offer that. He offered bravado. And bravado is often what people reach for when they've lost control but don't want others to know. Let's be very clear about something. Nobody forced Patrick to keep filming. Nobody forced him to keep promising. Nobody forced him to keep taking. Those are choices, and choices have consequences. Now, let's talk about the supporters still sending him money. Commissary, defense funds, moral support. Ask yourself something honestly. Why does sympathy so often flow toward the person who already benefited, instead of toward the people who were left behind? Why is there always money for the exploiter, but not for the exploited? That's not coincidence. That's culture. And it's a culture that rewards charm over accountability. This is why bonding out doesn't change anything. Because the harm didn't happen in a cell. It happened in a system. A system where money flowed through intermediaries. Content replaced consent. Control replaced care. Timing replaced obligation. Patrick was part of that system. Eric helped maintain it. And Timmy was trapped inside it. So when people ask, who exploited the Whittaker family? The honest answer is not a single name. It's a structure that allowed money to outrun ethics, that allowed content to outrun consent, that allowed control to masquerade as care. If both Patrick and Era played roles, why did so many people defend them for so long? And what does that say about how exploitation hides in plain sight? Because understanding that is the only way to stop this from happening again. Is controlling money the same as helping, or is it the first step toward exploitation? If this story were simple, it would have collapsed a long time ago. It didn't, because exploitation rarely survives on secrecy alone. It survives on belief. Belief that someone means well. Belief that intentions matter more than outcomes. Belief that questioning help is cruelty. And that belief system protected both Patrick Rourke and Eric Carroll far longer than the Whittaker family was protected. That's the part we have to face now. The comfort of a simple story. People don't defend exploitation because they love harm. They defend it because they love simple stories. A story where someone stepped in, someone helped, something good happened, and you got to be part of it. Once you accept that story, anything that threatens it feels like an attack, not on the facts, but on you. Because if the story is wrong, then supporting it wasn't neutral. It mattered, and that realization hurts. The savior narrative is powerful for a reason. Patrick was framed, and often framed himself, as someone who saw the Whittakers when others didn't. That matters psychologically. People are drawn to savior narratives because they resolve discomfort. Instead of sitting with systemic neglect, you get to believe one person fixed it, one person cared, one person stepped up. That narrative is emotionally satisfying. It's also dangerous because savior stories don't require accountability. They require gratitude, and gratitude silences questions. Why questions felt like attacks. When people raise concerns about money, consent, filming, delays, the reaction wasn't curiosity. It was hostility. Why? Because those questions threatened the emotional investment people had already made. If Patrick wasn't helping then, donations might have been misused. Trust might have been misplaced. Criticism might have been justified. And that's a lot to absorb. So instead of reassessing the structure, people defended it. The role of proximity and familiarity. Another reason this lasted so long is familiarity bias. People felt like they knew Patrick because they saw him often. They felt like they knew Eric because he spoke confidently. Visibility creates perceived trust. But visibility is not verification. In fact, high visibility often replaces verification. because people assume scrutiny has already happened. It hadn't. How Eric Carroll fit into the defense. This is where Eric Carroll becomes central to understanding the defense, not legally, but structurally. Eric was often positioned as the reasonable one, the organizer, the explainer, the buffer. That role matters. Because when someone plays translator between a vulnerable family and the public, they control the narrative. They decide what gets explained, what gets dismissed, what gets delayed, what gets reframed. And when people trust the translator, they stop asking the family. That's how voices disappear without being silenced directly. They needed someone, the most misused justification. One phrase shows up again and again. They needed someone. That statement carries an assumption that any intervention is better than none. But when vulnerable adults are involved, that assumption is false. Unregulated help can be worse than no help at all, because it blocks proper oversight, creates dependency, concentrates power, discourages outside intervention. Once a system forms, outsiders assume it's handled, and that assumption leaves families trapped. Why Timmy's silence made this easier. This is the part nobody wants to say out loud. Timmy Whittaker couldn't object. He couldn't complain publicly. He couldn't correct the narrative. He couldn't refuse participation in a way people would respect. So his silence was misread as agreement. That's not consent. That's vulnerability. And vulnerability is exactly what exploitation depends on. How filming normalized control. Once filming became routine, control felt normal. Where Timmy went, what he did, how he was presented. Those decisions were no longer questioned. They were expected. And when control becomes routine, people stop seeing it as power. They see it as care. That's the most dangerous transformation of all. At least he got experience's argument. This defense deserves special attention. People say, at least Timmy got to go places. At least he had fun. At least something good came out of it. That argument would never be accepted for a child. It shouldn't be accepted here either. Because experiences do not justify exploitation. Taking someone places while controlling their image, money, and access is not generosity. It's transactional. Why bonding out reignited the defense. When Patra bonded out, it gave defenders something familiar to grab onto. Relief, hope, vindication, fantasies. People want resolution, even false resolution, more than uncertainty. So they read bond as proof, as momentum, as validation. It wasn't. It was procedure. But procedure feels like progress if you're desperate for the story to end well. The hard truth about loyalty. Some people stayed loyal not because Patrick was right, but because leaving would mean admitting they ignored red flags. That's not stupidity. That's human nature. But it doesn't change the outcome. The Whittakers were still harmed. Timmy was still used. Money still flowed the wrong way. Loyalty doesn't undo that. How exploitation stays invisible. This is the pattern that keeps repeating everywhere. Vulnerable people gain attention. Helpers step in without structure. Money begins to flow. Control concentrates. Questions get framed as attacks. Defenders form. Harm becomes normalized. By the time the system cracks, people are too invested to see it clearly. Until arrests happen. Until families speak out. Until money stops. Why this wasn't obvious and why that matters. It's easy to judge in hindsight. But the lesson here isn't people were stupid. It's this. Exploitation is most effective when it looks like help, sounds like care, and rewards belief. That's why it lasted. That's why it was defended. And that's why understanding this matters more than condemning one person. What this means going forward. If people only blame Patrick, they miss the system. If people only defend Eric, they miss the outcome. If people only argue intention, they miss impact. And if people only focus on bond status, They miss everything that already happened. Where this leaves us, at the end of part 3, the picture is clearer and more uncomfortable. Patrick didn't act alone. Eric didn't operate in isolation. Supporters didn't mean harm, but harm still happened. And it happened because belief replaced verification. What accountability actually looks like now, and why moving on without standards guarantees this happens again. Because this story doesn't end with release. It ends when the rules change. Why do you think people defend systems longer than they defend victims? Fear, guilt, or loyalty? This is the point where most stories try to wrap themselves up. Patrick bonded out. Statements were made. Sides were chosen. And now there's pressure, subtle but constant, to move on. That instinct is understandable, but it's also dangerous, because moving on without accountability doesn't heal anything. It just resets the conditions for the same harm to happen again. So let's be very clear about what accountability means now, in real terms, not emotionally, not symbolically, but structurally. Accountability is not the same as punishment. This is where people immediately get defensive. They hear accountability and assume it means jail forever, public shaming, cancellation, revenge. That's not what we're talking about. Accountability is about alignment between actions and consequences. It asks, who had power? How was it used? What guardrails failed? What must change so this can't repeat? You can have accountability even if no one goes to prison. And you can have punishment without accountability if nothing changes. Why bonding out changes nothing structurally? Let's say this plainly. Patrick being free on bond does not undo unpaid promises, monetized content, delayed compensation, controlled access, misrepresentation. Bond is a procedural step, not a moral statement. It doesn't answer who controlled the money, who controlled the narrative, who controlled Timmy's access. So if people treat bonding out as closure, they're skipping the entire story. Accountability starts with naming the harm correctly. Before anything else, the harm has to be described honestly, not softened, not reframed, not diluted. The harm was not misunderstanding, drama, internet beef, good intentions gone wrong. The harm was exploitation of vulnerability. That doesn't require evil intent. It requires imbalance. And imbalance was everywhere here. Centering Timmy is non-negotiable. Every conversation that drifts away from Timmy Whittaker becomes suspect, because Timmy is the one person who could not consent, could not object publicly, could not negotiate terms, could not walk away. So any system that benefits others while limiting his agency is automatically flawed. Accountability means admitting this without qualification. Not, but he seemed happy. Not, but he got experiences. Not, but others benefited too. Those are deflections. Accountability requires separating roles from intentions. This is where Eric Carroll comes back into focus. People keep arguing about whether Eric is innocent. That framing misses the point. Accountability doesn't ask, did Eric wake up wanting to exploit someone? It asks, what role did Eric play once exploitation became possible? Did he manage access, shape narratives, discourage questions, distance the family when inconvenient, continue once red flags appeared? If the answer to any of those is yes, then accountability applies, regardless of intent. You don't need malicious intent to sustain harm. You only need to keep the system running. Accountability is collective, not just personal. Another uncomfortable truth. This didn't happen because one bad guy slipped through the cracks. It happened because supporters stopped asking hard questions. Content creators amplified without verifying. Audiences rewarded emotion over structure. Donors trusted intermediaries over receipts. That doesn't make everyone guilty, but it does mean everyone has responsibility to learn. Accountability includes supporters re-examining why they believed certain narratives, why they dismissed concerns, why they equated visibility with trust. If those patterns don't change, the next vulnerable family will face the same fate. What real accountability would look like now? So let's get specific. If accountability were actually happening, we would see 1. Transparent financial accounting. Not summaries, not explanations. Actual records showing what came in, where it went, who controlled it, who benefited. Anything less is evasion. 2. Clear acknowledgement of power imbalance. An explicit admission that Timmy could not consent. Filming created leverage. Money created dependency, without minimizing language. 3. Public commitment to new standards. No more, I'll do better. Actual rules. No filming vulnerable adults. No private donation routing. No exclusive access. No intermediaries without oversight. 4. Space for the family's voice. Not filtered, not translated, not curated. If the family chooses silence, that should be respected, but their voice should never be replaced. Why everyone makes mistakes isn't enough. People often reach for forgiveness language too early. Everyone makes mistakes. We all learn. Let's move forward. Those phrases sound mature, but when used prematurely, they become tools to avoid responsibility. Mistakes can be forgiven after accountability. Learning happens after harm is acknowledged. Skipping those steps guarantees repetition. Why popularity can't be the deciding factor. Another reason accountability stalls is fear. Fear of backlash. Fear of losing audience. Fear of losing community. But popularity has nothing to do with ethics. If standards bend based on subscriber counts or donations, they aren't standards. They're incentives. And incentives are what caused this problem in the first place. The cost of letting this fade away. If this quietly fades, here's what happens next. Another vulnerable family gets attention. Another helper steps in without structure. Another donation pipeline forms. Another audience believes. Another Timmy gets used. And everyone says, this time it'll be different. It won't be. Not unless the rules change. Accountability is a boundary, not a grudge. This is important to say. Accountability does not mean endless punishment, obsession, refusal to heal. It means boundaries. It means saying, this behavior is not acceptable. This structure will not be repeated. This harm will not be minimized. Then you move forward with safeguards. Where this leaves us. By part 4, one thing should be clear. This story does not end with Patrick free, Eric denying guilt, supporters choosing sides. It ends only when exploitation is named, systems are dismantled, standards are enforced. Until then, nothing is resolved. What must be required every time before anyone is allowed to help a vulnerable family again? Because that's the only ending that protects anyone. Is accountability about punishment or about changing the rules so this never happens again? This is where it ends, not with a verdict, but with a standard. Because if this story ends with people arguing about personalities, bond status, or who feels more believable, then nothing was learned. So here's the rule that has to exist going forward. Not just for this case, but for every vulnerable family that becomes visible. Help is not allowed without structure. Not later. Not eventually. From the beginning. If someone wants to help a vulnerable family like the Whittakers, the first question is not who they are. It's what authority they have. Who can legally consent? Who can legally refuse? Who can stop access? If that answer isn't documented, help stops right there. No filming. No fundraising. No, just trying to help. Because absence of authority is how exploitation starts. Second rule, money and access can never live in the same hands. The moment one person controls donations, visibility, transportation, communication, that person has power. And power over vulnerable adults must be fragmented, monitored, and reversible. No private accounts. No personal fundraisers. No, I'll handle it. If money can't be tracked, it can't be trusted. Third rule: consent is not assumed, performed, or implied. Especially not with someone like Timmy Whittaker. Smiling is not consent. Compliance is not consent. Participation is not consent. If someone cannot legally and meaningfully agree and withdraw that agreement, then the answer is already no. Anything else is justification. Fourth rule: content is never a requirement for care. If help depends on filming, posting, or engagement, it is already compromised. Care that disappears